If the Liberals had wanted to, if they had sort of had a genuinely held view that any semi-automatic firearm is sort of too much of a risk for a civilian to use, they could have banned those. And the fact that they didn't suggests quite strongly to me that this ban is really more about perception and optics than it is about actually removing firearms that the government thinks is dangerous from the market.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective addressing important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'll be your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this issue, we're going to talk some more about gun control, and I'm going to continue a series where I approach the topic of gun control in a scientific manner, where I lay out a hypothesis about what I think the evidence will show, and then move forward and try to interact with experts and learn a little bit more about what the data really say and what the policy should be. And maybe we can come together at the end of this series of talks with a more nuanced understanding of the politics and the facts surrounding this important issue. In May of 2020, when the Liberals came out with a recent assault rifle ban, the CBC ran a series of articles on gun control. One of these was titled, "Latest Gun Control Effort Isn't Merely a Failure, It Corrodes Trust Among Canadians." The author of this article is Toronto lawyer Jay Nathwani. Jay, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks very much for having me, Al.
And thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. I really enjoyed your article. It was enjoyable and, really along the lines of what I strive for in The Rational View here. And so I've decided to do a little investigation into gun control and get a flavor for the issues on both sides. So I've invited a few people to come and talk. And I'd really love to hear a little bit about yourself first, your background, and particularly on how your views on guns may have evolved over time.
Well, I'm a lawyer by training, though I don't practice criminal law. My focus is actually in construction law. So, professionally, this isn't something that I have any particular involvement in. It's more an issue that I guess I chose to write about because, in my experience, I grew up in Toronto, which it won't surprise anybody in Canada to know meant that I grew up in an environment where there wasn't a lot of familiarity with firearms, either among family members, friends, anybody I knew growing up with in a big city like Toronto. Generally speaking, the experience of firearms is a pretty negative one, right? You hear about a shooting or something like that. Didn't grow up knowing anybody who went hunting or was a recreational shooter or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So the environment I grew up in, the milieu I was surrounded with, was very much what you would, I suppose, expect for most people in a big city in Canada, which is that I think, culturally guns are viewed with a fair bit of suspicion.
Indeed.
And perhaps even the people who use them are viewed with some suspicion or lack of familiarity.
And most of the uses of guns in a city are illicit.
Well, for certainly any use of the gun inside the city, with a couple of exceptions. There was there are a couple. I don't even know if they're all still existing shooting ranges in Toronto. I know that Toronto City Council a number of years ago made a big deal of shutting down a shooting range that was located in Union Station that had hosted some pistol enthusiasts, some target shooters, mm-hmm. after a number of gang shootings in Toronto. And, it was one of those things that I have, never been a member of a pistol club or anything like that. But I remember at the time, just thinking like this was, you're taking two entirely separate phenomena and you're punishing one group of people who are hobbyists for something that criminals are doing with an entirely unrelated set of firearms. The illegal guns that are smuggled into gangs from the United States pose a risk that some aspiring Olympian target shooter practicing after hours at in a highly regulated environment in Union Station, there's no correspondence between the two. But that's the sort of reaction to guns that would, I think, sort of be typical of the city that I grew up in, where, because the guns that you hear about in the news or that you're familiar with in your day-to-day life, or because you're not familiar with other types of firearms, because the ones being used and that you're hearing about are illegal guns, you tend to view all firearms owners with suspicion, and it's almost like a cultural thing rather than sort of a rational thing. Despite
that, you wrote an article which is kind of knocking the gun ban, which may be an unpopular position amongst city dwellers.
I suspect it is an unpopular position among city dwellers, and I think that that's actually one of the main reasons for the ban. I found that in my experience, firearms is sort of the one area of policy, maybe not the only one, but one of the very few, where people who generally talk about how they're in favor of evidence-based policy, who would criticize, for instance, the conservative government under Stephen Harper for doing things like, doing away with the long-form census, or the mandatory long-form census, because it results in an inability to collect information, and it's so important to have information to make evidence-based policy. That sort of thing. The sorts of arguments we're very familiar with, and which actually I think have a lot of merit in many ways. We want to have sort of evidence-based policy.
That's what I'm all about here in The Rational View.
Yeah, exactly. People who are in favor of that in every other sphere of policymaking, when it comes to firearms, are willing to ignore whether there's evidence or a logical connection between a policy and a desired outcome, because there's this almost cultural suspicion of firearms owners, a distaste of firearms because of a complete lack of familiarity with it, and it's good to return, I think, to the point that you were making. It's popular in Toronto. It's popular in areas where, in this case, the Liberals, who are obviously the ones who brought in the change, want to win seats in an election, and that, I think, and it's something that I spoke about in the article. That's where I think we sort of get into some of the more pernicious effects of some of these changes, which is that if people feel that there are laws that are being brought in. We're talking in this case about amendments to the regulations to the criminal code, criminalizing certain firearms. If people feel that they're the target of the criminal law, not because there is really a rational basis for doing that, or an evidence-based basis for doing that, but in an effort to win votes, my concern is that beyond that just being bad policy, which I think it is on the basis of the evidence, it also has corrosive effects on the social trust and the ties that bind Canadians together.
You mentioned that this is bad legislation, and maybe we could just go through why you say that it's bad legislation in your article. Like, why does this particular gun not protect people? Why is it not evidence-based, in your opinion?
There's a couple places to start. One would be to say, what does this ban really do? And it was presented as a ban on, military-style firearms. And, it's worth noting that, the real military-style firearms, first of all, typically are ones that are fully automatic. And those have been banned in Canada for decades. You can't get those. What this change to the criminal code regulations did was it banned a large number of variants. There were about a dozen sort of basic types of semi-automatic firearms that tended to be the more popular ones, including, for instance, the AR-15, which we hear a lot about from the United States, where it's sometimes involved in mass shootings. These are the most popular, as I understand it, they're sort of the most popular semi-automatic firearms that sort of look like a military-style firearm. But what the ban didn't do was it didn't actually ban a certain capability in firearms with a certain capability. So you can still get a semi-automatic firearm that fires that holds the same number of cartridges in its magazine, that fires on semi-automatic mode, that's just as accurate, just as potentially deadly. You just can't get the kinds that are listed in these regulations. And the Liberals, when they brought this out, talked about military style firearms. Well, after this ban was brought in, you could still get IWI Tavor, which is a civilian market version of the firearm that the Israeli Defense Forces use, their standard issue military assault rifle.
Wow.
You could still get actual military surplus SKS rifles, which were manufactured in the Soviet Union or China and were their standard issue military rifles several decades ago. They're semi-automatic. These firearms have all the capabilities of the firearms that are being banned. They're just less popular. So you're shifting. You're certainly criminalizing a number of the firearms that are out there, but you're not stopping legal gun owners with the right licenses from acquiring firearms with the same capabilities in the future. You're going to shift the market to those new firearms. If the Liberals had wanted to, if they had sort of had a genuinely held view that any semi-automatic firearm is sort of too much of a risk for a civilian to use, they could have banned those. And the fact that they didn't suggests quite strongly to me that this ban is really more about perception and optics than it is about actually removing firearms that the government thinks is dangerous from the market.
From your description, it's either optics or a very embarrassing oversight.
Well, I mean, it has to be said that there were, on the list there were web forums. There was something like ar15.com or something like that. It was like there was a Facebook group that had a bunch of semi-automatic firearms enthusiasts or whatever. It sort of had the feeling like somebody had said to get the staffers to go and find a list of every kind of firearm that exists, and then we'll just drop that into the regulation. It didn't read as if it was being made by somebody informed with a lot of knowledge about firearms, and that should, I think, raise a few alarm bells in terms of, is this, it's a pretty drastic policy for the people who are affected. They're taking a piece of property that, they've maybe invested thousands of dollars into, and you're saying if you take it out of your house, you're in breach of the criminal code. You can get thrown in prison for this. Now, maybe that's appropriate under the right circumstances, but if you're going to do that sort of thing, I think it's incumbent upon anyone who wants to sort of wield that kind of power and law to really say, okay, well, like, what are we trying to accomplish here? Is this really connected to it? Is this comprehensive? Is this logical? Are there glaring gaps in here that are going to render this ineffective? So, why would we punish these people over here and leave these gaps over here? And it didn't really, to me, pass any of those sorts of common sense tests.
Yeah, you mentioned in your article that maybe magazine capacity is more important than whether the gun is so-called military style. And then you go on, as you say, to suggest that banning semi-automatic weapons may not be a bad idea at all.
Yeah, I think there's an argument, and to say that semi-automatic rifles, by their very nature, do pose an extra risk. And I think that people who are critical of the Liberal ban, I think also have to be honest and forthright about that. I mean, if you go back to, for instance, the Second World War, the American military, U.S. Army soldiers, considered it to be significantly to their advantage that the M1 Garand had, I think it was an 8-round clip, and that it was semi-automatic, that they could didn't have to operate a bolt on their rifles between shots in the way that German soldiers did with their bolt-action military rifles. So I think it's probably it would be going too far, I think, to say that there's no conceivable situation in which a semi-automatic rifle doesn't pose a potentially greater threat than a bolt-action rifle. I think you could make that argument. On the other hand, I think if you're going to ban something that has been legal for a long time, that a fair number of Canadians possess, and that you'd have to pay, to really be fair, you'd end up paying hundreds of millions of dollars potentially in compensation. I think you want to have not just, well, there's a logical argument in my mind that I can conceive of to say this is more dangerous. I think you want to have some actual evidence. And the Liberal government didn't even try to make an evidence-based case. And I think the inference probably to be drawn is that they didn't have an evidence-based case to make. So, what would an evidence-based case look like? Well, I think you'd say, how many homicides by firearm are there in Canada every year? How many of those involve rifles? How many of those involve semi-automatic rifles? And of those, how many were in how many of those cases did the semi-automatic nature of the rifle have any effect on the crime? If it was one shot with a rifle that killed somebody, well, it doesn't matter whether somebody could have taken a second follow-up shot faster. And then the other thing I think to ask is, of those cases, how many of those firearms were legally acquired in Canada? Because the biggest problem, in my view, that we have in Canada with firearms is not firearms that belong to law-abiding Canadian firearms owners. It's firearms that are smuggled in from the United States, and that's the sort of the gangs in Toronto or in other cities where there's gang violence involving firearms. Overwhelmingly, are not getting their firearms. They're certainly not walking into gun stores, they're not taking a firearms course and having a criminal background check and getting a firearms license and going into a gun store and buying them. And for the most part, they're not getting guns that even originate, have a legal source in Canada. They're guns that are being smuggled in from the United States. So if you get to that number and you say, okay, well, what's that number of homicides that are taking place in Canada from guns that would really be affected by this ban? Then you've got to look at the cost. Well, what's the cost of this ban? Well, how many millions of dollars are we going to pay in compensation to people for the fact that we've criminalized their property? And I would suspect that at the end of that sort of evidence-based analysis, there would not be a good case for this firearms ban. And I'd observe that the incident that seemed to have sparked this ban, which was, of course, the Portapique massacre in Nova Scotia, which was a horrendous massacre, the worst in Canadian history. From what I've seen, all but one of the firearms that were used in that massacre were smuggled in from the United States. And the perpetrator of that massacre did not have a licensed owned firearm. So all of those firearms in his possession were illegal. So it sort of makes you ask, are we dealing with the issues that underlie some of these crimes that we're concerned about? Or is this an act that allows the government to be seen to be doing something?
Virtue signaling.
And if it's the latter, then I don't think that you can, if you just want to be seen to be doing something and you want to give somebody like a tax credit, that's one thing. If you want to be seen to be doing something and you start criminalizing the property of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Canadians, that's a very different kind of government action, and I think has a much higher burden in terms of the evidentiary foundation for doing that.
It's very similar. We had the long gun registry under Chrétien back in, I think, 95 is when they started that, and then Harper eventually shut that down. But they spent $1 billion trying to register these guns, and they have no evidence, as far as I can tell, that made any effect whatsoever on gun deaths.
Nor I think even from the outset was there a sort of a plausible logical connection. I mean, that's another. These are the sort of twin examples of liberal governments reacting to horrendous massacres. Right, the long gun registry was a reaction to the Montreal massacre, but even at the time there was no, I don't think, logical articulable cause or effect that registry could have. I mean, somebody has legally acquired their rifle or their shotgun, and you make them register it. how does that stop them from committing a crime with it? It doesn't.
It's very lazy. It seems like it's just image maintenance rather than actually attempting to have an effect on the situation.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue with the gun registry was that it was sold, the long gun registry was that it was sold as this, something that's going to stop crime. What it really was a potentially moderately useful investigative tool. I found a firearm. I don't know where it came from. And I can check now based on the serial number of the gun, and it's potentially been registered at some point, I can see who the last legal owner of it was. Okay, there's a marginal potential usefulness there for criminal investigators. Is that sufficient to justify angering, a lot of people who feel like, look, my property is now being treated as sort of potentially criminal, and on the other hand, the cost that was associated, as you say, $1 billion, and the federal government in Canada has a very poor track record of program delivery. It can't. We're a country that we can't acquire. We can't acquire goods for our military on any kind of a reasonable timeline. We can't. We can't get a gun registry going for less than $1 billion. This is keeping a list. We can't even pay our federal civil servants reliably and on time. So, you've kind of got to question is whatever policy is being announced, is it going to be implemented in a way that's efficient? What are the real goals that can be achieved here? Instead, these bans, whether it's the registry, which is of course not a ban, or the more recent ban, are being oversold by a government, I think, that wants to be seen to be doing something, but in situations where the real solutions or mitigative measures that you can take in response to these kinds of crimes are actually much more difficult. It's hard to stop someone who with significant criminal intent from carrying out those crimes, but if you could reduce the flow of illegal guns into Canada, that would be something. But it would be very expensive to put, scan every vehicle coming into this country, or I don't know what technical measures could be put into place. But I do know that treating people who have gone through a very rigorous licensing process, it's not easy to get a license in Canada for firearms. I think that's completely appropriate, especially not for restricted firearms like the AR-15. Taking people who've gone through that process and legally acquired their firearms and saying, you're now criminal if you take this out of the house. I don't see that that's really addressing the causes of the crimes that are killing Canadians. Yeah,
I think in my opinion, the most effective use of funds, if we say that this is a risk that we want to tackle, is basically to lobby for tighter gun restrictions in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that would be if that happened, it would be effective at preventing crime in Canada. I don't know whether it would be a useful way of spending our money. The politics in the United States around guns are so polarized, and it's I don't know what effect we could have on that. In fact, I expect that having a bunch of Canadians come and try to prevent Americans from owning firearms might play right into the hands of the NRA in terms of their lobbying efforts.
One option that I've read is actually feasible to include biometric locks on all new guns, and that's been something that people have been lobbying for. And apparently, these are being developed in other countries, but the NRA has been pouring millions of dollars into preventing their use in the U.S.
That's an interesting issue, and I will confess that my reaction to that, I've sort of seen some reporting on that, and I appreciate that in Canada, almost without exception, Canadian law does not contemplate the use of firearms for self-defense. You can't own a handgun, for instance, in Canada for self-defense. The only way you can own a handgun, or at least transport it out of your house, is if you are a member of a target shooting club. So it's sort of a very different milieu in Canada legally. You're supposed to own a firearm in Canada because you want to go, duck hunting or deer hunting or whatever, or you're a sports shooter. We're not a country that embraces self-defense as a cause for firearms. But to the extent that there is a valid potential use of firearms in self-defense. And the city is not a good example of this, right? And city dwellers grow up in a milieu that's so different. They're not equipped to really, they're not equipped, but they don't think about this, right? If you're in the city and you dial 911, the police are a few minutes away. If you're in a rural setting and somebody is trying to break into your house or something like that, the police might as well be on a different planet in terms of what happens between the time you place the call and the time you get there. Maybe you do need firearms for self-defense. And in that case, I understand the objection to sort of biometrics, which is, that the purpose of a firearm and the fundamental design, what every gun manufacturer strives for is that firearm is going to fire reliably and accurately when the trigger is pulled with a certain amount of force and not under any other circumstance. I pick up my iPhone and I have the Touch ID.
Fingerprint scanner.
And, if my finger's a little bit sticky or, I just got it in some jam or something like that, or it's wet, I just washed my hands and not dried them well enough, that biometric scanner is not going to work. The last thing you want with a firearm is that you need to use it, and because the biometric ID doesn't recognize your handprint well enough, or there's some emergency and you need to give it to somebody else to use, that firearm doesn't operate. I could see the objection, certainly among Americans for whom it's the defensive use of a firearm is a legitimate use in law. And the reason that a lot of Americans acquire firearms, I can see why somebody would object to that. I think that in Canada, it's a slightly different legal environment. Well, it's a very different legal environment. And I think you get into the question of, well, how many of these firearms are being used by people who aren't their legal owners? I think when it comes to illegal use of firearms, that answer is probably pretty high. Mm-hmm. Would they be unable to bypass these sorts of protections? I don't know. I think it's an area where there could be an awful lot of room for debate. It's something that maybe should be considered. I don't have very strong feelings on it one way or the other, but I do think that I think it's very unlikely to gain any traction in the market, in the U.S. market, which is really in many ways the relevant market for the guns that are being used illegally here, for the reasons that I talked about a couple minutes ago.
Mm-hmm. I see one of the bigger benefits of that sort of thing is preventing accidents, like with children playing with guns, that sort of things.
Yeah, I think that the children playing with guns thing, I mean, that's absolutely, you hear in the United States about, a few hundred children a year that die by accidental discharge. That's something that I think can be much more easily prevented by any responsible gun owner. I mean, the problem there is that there's a lot of Americans who because of the culture around guns there, and maybe a lack of awareness or education, store firearms incredibly unsafely. I mean, people store firearms loaded under their bed with the idea that in the middle of the night, if somebody bursts through the door, they just grab their gun and go to town, and then their kid is playing in the day and they look under the bed and they pull out this loaded firearm. I mean, it's just unbelievable negligence that leads to these sorts of accidents. A firearm that is just a traditional firearm that's safely stored with unloaded, you lock up the ammunition in one container, you lock up the firearm in another, or you've got a trigger lock on it, more than addresses, I think, any of those sorts of concerns. You don't need an expensive, sort of untested, potentially unreliable technological solution. All you need is people to be responsible. Yeah,
that's a good point, and so it's the difference between people that feel they need to sleep with their guns and the people that feel they can store them safely.
Yeah, exactly.
You make a good point in your article, and this is kind of the thesis of it. The legislation seems to be pandering to the liberal base and angering political opposition for no real benefit to society. And I love your quote that you put: A healthy democracy relies on citizens believing that they will not be treated unfairly if their side loses an election. We should not be putting that trust at risk. It's not too much to ask that firearms laws be made on the basis of evidence and reason. And this, of course, resonates with the rational view. And this sort of partisan game playing has increased polarization. We've seen the effect of it down south in the democratic process, I think. And I think that's a key observation, that we should be opposing this sort of partisan game playing.
Yeah, I think that regardless of where you sit on the debate in terms of is more stringent gun control a good idea or a bad idea, I think that it's incumbent upon us to insist that policy be made on the basis of evidence and that it be made in sort of a coherent manner. And a ban that, as the Liberals' recent ban did, bans some firearms but not others with identical characteristics, sends the message to the people who own these firearms that this is purely a political action design. It's not anything to do with the actually with public safety, and the effect of that is more than just to create a ban that isn't particularly useful. The message it sends is, we're punishing you by criminalizing your property simply because it's good for us politically. It plays well with our base. It'll help us to win some swing ridings. And when people feel that their government is punishing them because it's good politically, and that their fellow citizens are applauding that because there's sort of a complete lack of empathy there between citizens, I think that's really corrosive of social trust. I think that as citizens of a democracy, we need to be able to trust that if the other side wins an election, while there may be policies that we don't like, there may even be policies that aren't good for us. I mean, there's always winners and losers in public policy. That those policies are being put into place in good faith and on the basis of some kind of a real effect that they're going to have. If it's being done to win votes, it makes people trust the other side of the political aisle less. People who own these firearms, who will tend to be more conservative, they'll tend to be more rural, will look at their fellow citizens who live in cities and who sort of applaud these measures that don't affect them or anybody they know, and they're going to resent those people. They're going to resent the urbanites who have never fired a firearm in their life and know nothing about them, who applaud a law that is criminalizing the property of them or their neighbors that has real effects. That drives unseen wedges between people in society. It's very destructive in ways that are hard to measure and hard to quantify. I think the bigger issue is it makes people feel targeted, simply for engaging in a pastime that their urban brethren don't have any time for, don't have any appreciation of, and don't really like. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's more harmful in the long run than anything to do with whether it actually is effective as gun control.
Yeah, and we're lucky in Canada as compared to the U.S. that we don't have a huge gun problem, and it's not, we don't have all these school shootings and all this horrible tragedy. We have 6 times less gun violence per capita in Canada than the U.S. I mean, it's just not high up on our list of things that kill people here, and that's good. So I agree wholeheartedly that public policy needs to be more rational. It seems that it's very easy in the current milieu of journalism and sound bites to do lazy image manipulation rather than useful policy making. And I don't know how we counter this and drive it back in the other direction. But what would you like to see happen to help that?
That's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. I think that one of the ironies of this policy is that, Justin Trudeau is, I think, probably more than any other politician in Canada, built his self-image around the idea of empathy. And I think that when you're bringing in a policy that has significant effects on other people, I think there's a duty to try to empathize with the other side of a debate. Try to see things from their perspective. That goes both ways. It's not just in this one way on this debate. But for people who sort of instinctively distrust firearms and want to look at any kind of gun control measure as probably a positive thing, what I'd say is try to put yourself in the position of somebody else, somebody who has spent hundreds or thousands of dollars on a firearm that they can only transport. By law in Canada, restricted firearms are very tightly regulated. You can't. You need an authorization to transport that firearm. You take it from your house to the range and back. It's a very tight regime. Put yourself in the position of somebody who has subjected themselves to all those regulations, complied with them, spent a lot of time and money doing it because they have a pastime, a hobby that they really enjoy. They lock up their firearms safely. They're far less likely to statistically, they're extremely unlikely to engage in any kind of violent crime. I think firearms owners in Canada are statistically less likely than the majority of Canadians to engage in violent crime. Put yourself in their position, and then these laws come in, and their property is criminalized, their pastime is affected as a result of why is this being done to me? Well, it's being done to me because somebody who acquired firearms that were illegally brought in from the United States committed a massacre, or it's being brought in because gang members who illegally acquired firearms from the United States shot somebody. How would that make you feel? And I think that, look, it's not these debates there's a bit of a paradox here, which is that I'm saying I think policy needs to be based on reason and evidence. I'm also saying you should try to think about how the other side feels. So it's not to say that we subordinate reason and evidence to people's feelings, but if that policy is going to antagonize your fellow citizens, I think there's a real duty then to ensure that it's based on reason and evidence. The example that I use in the column, because I think it's one that might resonate more readily with Canadians, is imagine that in a decade or so, electric cars are much more popular. They're cheaper. The technology's come along. It might make sense, or it might not make sense for the government to say we're going to ban gasoline, diesel powered cars. We're going to move all to electric cars. You can have a debate about whether that's a good idea or not. But imagine that the government said, we're going to ban a Ford Explorer, but not a Chevy Suburban. Take two vehicles that have, let's say they have identical fuel economy. The unfairness of that would, I think, be readily apparent to anybody. They'd say, well, look, maybe these vehicles are bad for the environment. Maybe they're dangerous. Maybe they should be banned. But it can't be the case that you ban some models but not others that have the same fuel economy. I mean, how can that be right? And the argument that I sometimes heard is, well, but it's a step in the right direction. It's doing something. I think that this example might help to bring out why that argument, I think, doesn't hold water. That you either have to be consistent, the policy either has to have a certain internal consistency to achieve its desired ends, or it's just arbitrary. It's not like a step in the right direction to ban, in this example, some cars that have a certain fuel economy and not others. Mm-hmm. It's arbitrary. It's unfair. And that's what, in my view, this gun ban is, because of its sort of slipshod technical basis. It's the kind of thing that you do if you just want to be seen to be doing something. You don't really know that much about firearms. So as I say, you get some intern in the minister's office to go and look up every variant of an AR-15 and a Facebook group makes it in. I mean, these are not indicia of a ban that's a law that's carefully crafted and well thought out.
It seems it was highly opportunistic,
exactly,
based on the situation of the mass shooting, and someone said, "Hey, we can get a gun ban in place without pissing off too many people right now."
Yeah, well, and crucially, without pissing off people who are potentially going to vote for us. And this is one of those aspects of it that I think is so corrosive. Is that it's probably going to be politically good for the Liberals in places where they're competing for ridings with the NDP, or with Conservatives, maybe among suburban voters for whom they're more on the Liberal side of this issue than on the Conservative side of this issue. Yeah, it's gonna, the people it'll piss off are not the voters that the Liberals are chasing, but I think democracy demands more of us in terms of policy making, certainly when it comes to the use of criminal law, than to say, is this angering people who are going to hurt us in an election, or is it just angering people on the other side who we never really liked anyway?
Agreed. I think that's good, and I think maybe we'll have to end there or run out of time. So thank you for joining me here on The Rational View and presenting your opinions. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure, Al. Thank you so much for having me.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page and becoming a patron of this podcast at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView.